Hello YouTube. Over the years I've covered many stories set in the Elder Scrolls universe, but none are as intriguing as stories set in the far, far past of Tamriel's history, as those stories give some insights into what Tamriel was like far before our playtimes, in times that we'll likely never see in any of the games, but whose stories have survived for us to enjoy. So today I put some of the best and most interesting stories and legends from Tamriel's ancient history that I've covered over the years into one long form lore video for you to enjoy, with timestamp chapters so you can skip any part you may already know, or skip to a part that you really want to know. So that being said, let's roll the intro and talk about Tamriel's ancient history, starting with one of my favorite stories, that of the Merethic era dragon priest abandoned by her dragon. This story begins in the Merethic era, in the years before the humans of Skyrim clashed with the dragons in a dragon war. It was during this period that humans were ruled over by the dragons and their priests, the dragon priests functioning as a sort of mouthpiece to the dragons and their human subjects to communicate the dragons' wishes. It had been this way ever since the early Nedic tradition had been brought to Tamriel by the earliest human settlers from Admora, as they worshipped animals and saw the dragons as chief among the animals and chief in their pantheon. This system functioned well, as the dragons didn't concern themselves too much with the affairs of mortals, acting almost like living gods to them, while making their few wishes known through their dragon priests, who were mortals chosen by the dragons to represent them. They received special powerful masks and reportedly held some sort of special connection to their dragon overlords. This brings us to the dragon priest Zaan, the only female dragon priest in recorded history so far, and incidentally also the only dragon priest that we can see the face of beneath the mask before she turned undead, like many of the other late dragon priests. As obviously we can see the faces of dragon priests in Skyrim when we remove their masks, but this is obviously not how they looked while they were alive. We actually see how Zaan looked when she was alive in this concept art. Anyway, Zaan was selected by the mighty golden dragon Turvokun at a very young age, extraordinarily young according to many, likely anywhere between 15 and 25 years old. And her connection to the dragon was also extraordinary. Apparently, according to witnesses at the time, the mystical connection between the dragon and their chosen priest was stronger in Zaan than the connection of many other priests to their dragons, and people marveled about this special connection between Zaan and the dragon Turvokun. The two were very close, and Zaan grew a very strong attachment to Turvokun, something which the followers of Turvokun saw as a sign of great fortune for their people, and Zaan would soon become a very popular and influential leader among the people, eventually getting the nickname Skill Caller by her and Turvokun's followers. Now, for unknown reasons, Zaan and Turvokun led their people away from Skyrim to find a new home at some point. We don't know why they left the province, but in-universe historians believe that it may have been due to differences with the other dragon cults. Perhaps they left of their own choice, or perhaps other dragon priests and other dragons forced them out. Maybe they were wary of Zaan's strong connection to Turvokun, or perhaps the reason was something else entirely. Regardless of their reasons to leave Skyrim, Zaan and Turvokun led their followers to an ancient orcish temple complex in the mountains of High Rock. This grand temple and its surroundings served as their new home for nearly a decade. The people were prosperous under Zaan's leadership, and Turvokun watched over the people as his magic protected them while they lived on the mountain. Life for Zaan and the followers of Turvokun was good. That is, until Turvokun suddenly disappeared, abandoned his cult and his priest Zaan. One day he simply no longer showed up at the temple. In the first few days and weeks, his followers and Zaan held hope that he would return to them, but as the days grew longer and Turvokun did not return, discontent started to form in the cult, and Zaan fell into a deep depression because of the abandonment by her dragon. It wasn't long before the members of the cult started blaming Zaan for Turvokun's disappearance. They blamed her weakness and her incompetence, while Zaan kept them in the temple complex, hopeful that Turvokun would return before their cult would fall apart in chaos. Some continued to support her, however, the longer Turvokun was absent, the more followers turned on her. But Turvokun never returned, and after a few months Zaan was killed by her own followers. They killed her on the very peak of the mountain shrine that she prayed on for Turvokun's return, her blood turning the ground and snow red. Her former followers tried to steal her Dragon Priest mask, but it would not come off her body, and then the former followers left her there, as they left the temple to build themselves a new life on the outside. Zaan would later be reanimated as an undead years later, maybe by a Necromancer, and the newly raised Zaan would become a servant of Periite, carrying Spellbreaker in his name. How exactly and by whom she was raised is unknown. Perhaps she was already under the influence of incantations, allowing her to become undead before she was killed. We really don't know how she got resurrected. What we do know is that as an undead, she served the cult of Periite in the very temple in which her followers killed her. Whether she served Periite out of free will or was simply a husk under the control of a Necromancer is all unknown, but I would like to argue that her animated form, which is the final boss of a dungeon in the Elder Scrolls Online, is absolutely not what's interesting about her story, as, well, the interesting part comes before she died, as her reanimated form basically, at least to me, seems like an excuse to just use her as a final boss. But what is interesting to discuss to me from a lore perspective is, however, why Turvokun left and where he went. Interestingly enough, we have a concrete answer to that second question, because we know that when Turvokun abandoned Zaan and his cult, he went to a Dwemer city, Arkanthum's Fung, which was one of the cities of the Dwemer Kragan clan. By this time in the Meretic era, the Dwemer were still alive, and the story goes that the dragon invaded their city all by itself, killing each and every Dwemer inside, after which it claimed the city for its own and hid itself in the lowest chambers, far from any civilization. In those deep chambers, Turvokun apparently hid away, surviving the Dragon War and then also surviving the dragon hunts by the Riemann Emperor's Dragon Guard. He laid low, having no contact with the outside world, killing all who dared enter the ancient Dwemer city. The city, Arkanthum's Fung, came to be known as Fang Lair, and none dared come close, as the legends of the dragon who made its home there persisted. That is, until 3 adventurers in the last years of the First Era entered the ancient city with the objective of slaying the legendary dragon rumored to be holding itself up in the city. These 3 adventurers managed to slay the dragon Turvokun, although only one of them survived the ordeal, who then tried to experiment with Turvokun's bones and flesh, even eating some of his flesh after roasting it. Years later, its skeleton would be reanimated by a Necromancer in the Second Era, and like its former dragon priest, would serve as a final dungeon boss in the Elder Scrolls Online, but of a different dungeon, obviously. Anyway, good stuff, and a pretty anticlimactic ending to the dragon story, but it does answer the question as to where he went. Now, the real question is, why did he leave in the first place? What's caused him to sever his strong bond with Zaan and abandon the followers which worshipped him like a literal god? Well, the games don't really give us any concrete answers, but I have 3 theories. One is a bit of a boring theory, because we know from a Daggerfall era text that the dragon living in Fang Lair, so Turvokun, was quite vain and power hungry. Perhaps Turvokun had heard the Dwemer's exploits and their wealth dug up at Arkanthum's Fung's mines, and he was simply tempted to go and steal it, but that, in my opinion, isn't an adequate explanation, as to the dragon could have simply taken his followers and his priest to the Dwarven Ruin and used them to help take it over, as their bond was quite strong and he probably trusted them. That way he would still be worshipped and his strong connection with Zaan would still be intact. Now, another theory states that Zaan, for some reason, became a follower of Periite before Turvokun abandoned her. He felt betrayed and then left her behind, together with his followers. But that again seems unlikely in my opinion, as if that was the case, Zaan would have likely acted far differently in the final months. Nothing to say of the fact that Turvokun could have just killed her and replaced her with a new priest. The most likely theory in my opinion is the one shared with me by my friend Mr. Christmas, who carried me through the dungeons for the research of this video. His theory states that while Turvokun was away from the temple, as he often was for short periods, he heard from other dragons that the Nords of Skyrim had started to rebel against their rule, and that the Dragon War had started. Perhaps he even learned already of Parthenex's defection to the human side, and he suddenly saw the writing on the wall for his kind and decided that he needed a place to lay low unless he too wanted to become a target for the Nords. Or perhaps he was afraid that his followers would turn on him. So instead of returning to the temple, he disappeared, and he laid low in order to survive. Hold himself up in some deep Dwemer ruin until the end of time. He couldn't take his followers, even if he trusted them, as they saw him as a god, and such a cowardly move of hiding away would have likely had them turn on him. So he left, never to be seen again by his followers and not even by the human most dear to him, his priest Zaan. And that is the story of Zaan and Turvokun, and how the latter abandoned his chosen priest. A bit of a sad story, ending on some speculation. This is by far one of my favorite stories of ancient Tamriel, which is why I'm so happy to share it. Now, next up is a story about an ancient Argonian necromancer who went mad trying to save the one that he loved. It's another tragic story, but definitely one worth telling. So back in the early Merethic era, in the time that the Argonians call the Age of the Stone Nests, there lived a very powerful and respected sorcerer in the southern reaches of Blackmarsh. His name was Kaar, and he was very much known for his great healing powers and his competency with healing spells. He healed many Argonians in his day with magic, rising to prominence as a healer for all. Because of his reputation, he served as a very important advisor to the Argonian rulers at the time. His advice was often highly regarded, and while he was loved by the people, some say that he was also feared, specifically by the rulers, for he held great power, much greater power than just the power to heal his fellow Argonians. He had the power to create much evil if he so wanted. Fortunately for the Argonians, at the time he really only wanted to heal people and do good for society. But his name wouldn't be the Mad Sorcerer if this ideal situation had continued forever, as at some point his personality and goals changed drastically. You see, Kaar had a mate, which is basically the Argonian equivalent of a love interest. And unfortunately this mate got terribly sick from an unknown disease, which slowly tore her down until nothing would be left of her but a corpse. It is during this period that Kaar desperately searched for a cure for his mate. He searched in all the realms of healing, from alchemy to magical spells, and he searched for a way that could help him either freeze or cure the disease that his mate was having. Unfortunately, he found no cure, and his mate kept regressing in health. Despite all his efforts, he wasn't able to save her life, and the loss turned him mad, turning him into necromancy. After her death, he used necromantic arts to revive her corpse and kept her at his side as a mindless corpse, trying to find ways to restore her consciousness after death somehow, dabbling in even darker necromantic practices, trying to find a solution and bring her back to life. The Argonians of his time were disgusted by this practice, and they saw it as an abomination against the order of things, and pleaded with Kaar to please let his mate find rest after death. But he ignored their pleas, and he then got the nickname the Mad Sorcerer. When he noticed the hostility against him within the Argonian society, he went into seclusion, taking over an abandoned Zenmir pyramid and turning it into his own laboratory for necromancy, as he presumably kept trying to find a way to fully revive his mate. In his laboratory, he turned to increasingly darker experiments and gained an obsession with them. The only thing he really now cared about were his experiments, as he experimented on bodies from all around the mire. Many of his experiments failed, some even caused the bodies that he experimented on to turn into vile and evil necromantic creatures that escaped Kaar's pyramid and assaulted the people of Blackmarsh. After this incident of the escaping necromantic creatures, which Kaar didn't really seem to care about, nor did he want to solve them, he didn't care at all that his creatures were murdering people in the streets, the rulers of Murkmire decided to take action against him. They sent a band of warriors to assault the pyramid that he was holed up in and stop the experiments and dark rituals. Kaar, however, had seen this action coming in his paranoia, and thus he armed the Zenmir pyramid with many undead creatures to defend it. For 33 days and 33 nights, the Argonians of the Mire besieged Kaar's Zenmir pyramid. Many of them fell to the Mad Sorcerer's spells and to his thralls, and those who fell were then raised back up to help the Necromancer defend this stronghold. After more than a month, mages arrived from all over Blackmarsh to help combat the vile sorcerer, and then tide turned on Kaar, as the warriors of the Mire, together with some magical help, managed to close in on his Zenmir pyramid. When the ancient Argonian warriors finally breached his pyramid, Kaar knew that the pyramid would soon fall, and he performed a ritual in which he thought that he would be able to get revenge for the Argonians trying to stop him. The ritual that he performed consumed his entire body, transferring all the power and energy that he had to his skull, which turned into solid gold. The skull was then imbued with a curse, powered by the Mad Sorcerer's energy and presumably the energy of the bodies that he had reanimated. The skull's curse, if unleashed, would have the power to destroy a very large region. How exactly the skull would do this is unknown. Perhaps the skull would explode or something, or spread some sort of biting or killing cloud or spell around it. All we know is that the warriors and the mages breaching the pyramid were likely quickly enough to prevent the skull and its curse from being activated, meaning that the supposed catastrophe never came and Kaar was no more. All that was left was his skull, which would be forever cursed. At the order of the rulers of the region at the time, the mages that assaulted the Zanmir took the skull carefully and transported it to the forbidden island of Norgtzel, which is an island somewhere off the coast which was hidden, and there the skull was to be remained hidden forever. Unfortunately, 2 eras later the skull would be found again by a band of artifact hunters, but you, as the player in the Elder Scrolls Online, can prevent them from getting a hold of the skull and then hand the relic over to Cyrodiil Collections, a museum organization which is dedicated to the careful preservation of Argonian relics, and to make sure that, curses like this don't get released. What happened to the body of Beelakar's tragically deceased mate is unknown. I presume that the Argonians that assaulted the tower either put her to rest, or perhaps her energy and body were also consumed in the creation of the golden skull of Beelakar. And that was the tragic story of the Argonian necromancer Beelakar. But even though it's tragic, it's another really good story in my opinion. Now, next up, let's talk about the story of a man who has gone down in history as possibly the very first dragon rider, Lyrisius. So in the early First Era, likely more than 2 to maybe even 3,000 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, Tamriel looked very different. For one, there had not been a Cyrodiilic Empire yet, and at this time, Skyrim had only relatively recently come under human control at the end of the Merethic Era. And other than Skyrim and likely some parts of Hammerfell, the majority of Tamriel was still under the control of the Elvish races. We have very little solid knowledge of this ancient time, but the legend of the hero Lyrisius survived. When Lyrisius lived, northern Tamriel was often being raided by the armies of Akavir. These armies, at the time known as slavers, apparently captured humans living in the northern regions of Tamriel and forced them to work as slaves, likely taking them back to Akavir on their ships to work back on their home continent. Lyrisius at this time was a human warrior, likely a Nord or even a Proto-Nord, who defended the human settlements against the Akaviri raiders. He apparently single-handedly slew hundreds according to the legend, and he even became favored by the Daedric prince Boethia and received the shield Fearstruck, one of Boethia's Daedric artifacts, as her gift. With the Daedric prince's shield and his mighty enchanted spear, Lyrisius and the warriors who followed him were a mighty force to be reckoned with for the Akaviri slaver pirates. But at one point, Lyrisius and his warriors were confronted with a presumably particularly strong Akaviri raiding party, almost as big as an army. This force decimated Lyrisius and his warriors and scattered them. Lyrisius himself was hounded by the Akaviri forces and fled far, far away from any human settlements to a place where the Akaviri would not find him. Eventually he ended up in a large, desolate area where he found a gigantic winged worm, which had the ability to breathe fire and the ability to speak, so most likely it was a dragon, so from now on I'll call it a dragon. This dragon had no intention of letting Lyrisius walk free on the lands that he controlled, so Lyrisius and the dragon fought a long and apparently epic duel in which the legendary shield Fearstruck, a Daedric artifact, was apparently molten to rubble by the dragon fire. Lyrisius was beaten, and the dragon was going to devour him, but Lyrisius pleaded with the dragon and offered his services as a slave to the dragon, since the mighty beast had beaten him. The dragon's pride was so great at this offer that he agreed, and Lyrisius thought, well, let's continue with the flattery, and he told the dragon that he was absolutely majestic, except for one scale on his back between his great wings, which according to Lyrisius had become dull and in need of polishing, but that particular skill was out of reach for the dragon. He couldn't reach it with his neck or with his wings, so Lyrisius offered to polish it. The dragon, in his vanity, allowed Lyrisius on his back to polish the skill, but it just so happened that Lyrisius still had a hidden dagger with him, and he plunged the dagger right under the scale in the middle of the dragon's back. The beast roared and struggled as he rolled, dove from the air, and shook himself with all his strength, attempting to throw the hero Lyrisius off its back, but the hero held firm and held on to the dragon's neck. When the dragon realized that he couldn't throw Lyrisius off, Lyrisius made the dragon an offer. Fly straight on until you see the Akaviri. Use your fire to destroy them, and once they're destroyed, I will remove my blade. The dragon, in pure rage at the situation, shot up in the air and flew towards the Akaviri raiders and completely decimated them with his fire from the air. When it was done and the slavers lay dead, the dragon demanded that Lyrisius remove his blade while they were still flying mid-air, which the hero did, and he quickly leapt off the beast's neck, falling towards the surface, as he knew that if he'd stayed on the beast's neck for longer, he'd have been thrown off and the dragon would attempt to kill him. And of course that was the plan of the dragon, as the dragon attempted to kill him as he fell towards the surface, but as Lyrisius was falling, the Daedric prince Boethia appeared to him and changed him into a raven, making him small and nimble enough to lose the dragon in the clouds. We don't know whether Lyrisius was ever changed back, or if this story actually happened on Tamriel, or if it is just a legend. The book even contains the disclaimer that scholars at the time of Daggerfall are skeptic about the story being based in facts, and thus it is most likely a legend. But there are some interesting things about this legend, as usually all legends hold at least a shimmer of truth. First of all, Bethesda, or at least ZeniMax, has not forgotten about this Daggerfall era legend, as a replica of Fearstruck, the shield, is actually available in the Elder Scrolls Online in the Crown Store. At least it is sometimes in November. In its description it even has that it's a replica, because the original one was destroyed in the fight of the hero Lyrisius, and it even directly mentions the Akaviri slavers. Second, the legend itself is at the very least about 1800 years old by the time of Skyrim, as it predates the first Akaviri invasion, which happened in the year 2703 of the First Era. You see, at the end of the story, where the Akaviri slavers are burned down by the dragon, the author of the story says, and I quote, "The Akaviri had no chance against the fire-breathing beast. They have never plagued Tamriel since." You see, that last part is not true, as in the year 2703 of the First Era, about 1700 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the first Akaviri invasion took place, where the Saci of Akavir invaded Tamriel in search for a Dragonborn, only to be stopped by Reem and Cyrodiil, who would go on to found the Reeman Empire with their help once they found him as Dragonborn. Watch my introduction to the Elder Scrolls lore video for that full story. Anyway, the forces of Akavir have invaded Tamriel again after this story, in the first Akaviri invasion and then even later in the second Akaviri invasion. Meaning that the story must predate the first Akaviri invasion, as the second Akaviri invasion was in the Second Era, and this story mentions them never invading again, but around the end of the First Era there was another invasion. And add to that the wording, "they have never plagued Tamriel since," which suggests to me that the story was already old when it was written down, meaning that it was likely at least written down 100 years after the story of Lyrisius actually took place, and thus 100 years at least before the first Akaviri invasion, and likely even longer, because the story in its written down form is already written in the form of a legend, so it's already no longer in concrete memory. So I personally think it's like 500 to maybe 300 years old by the time it was written down. Meaning that this story is at the very least 1900 years old by the time of Skyrim, if we take the story of at the time of writing being 100 years old, and it's likely even older. To put that in perspective, 1900 years ago in our time, the Roman Empire hadn't even reached its height of power yet, so it's a really long time ago. But it may even be older, to potentially a maximum of 4400 years ago, which is really cool to me somehow. Anyway, let's not get lost in the math of how I calculated all of this, because there is another very interesting implication to the story, specifically to the fact that the earliest Akaviri pirate raids, which we already knew of happened before the first Akaviri invasion long ago in the First Era, were apparently pretty big groups, as in this story it's actually described as an army, and they apparently came to capture human slaves on Tamriel. You see, if you watch my video on the races of Akavir, which is in the description if you haven't seen it, you will know that there is a debate going on whether there ever lived humans on Akavir, or whether the Saci are in fact humans or not. But this story of humans being taken to Akavir as slaves long before the first Akaviri invasion implies that perhaps the Saci civilization had humans as slaves in it, or later, maybe after the pirate raids stopped after the story of Lyrisius, they perhaps were no longer slaves and rather part of the Saci civilization, perhaps as a sort of second-class citizen. That would explain the contradictory sources of the serpents and humans among the Akaviri armies in the invasion, as they may have both been in there, as the Saci brought human combat slaves or drafted humans into their army for the first Akaviri invasion, explaining the human Akaviri ghosts in Oblivion that we see, and at the same time it explains the really long lifespan of the Akaviri potentates, who were described as serpent-like, as both of them fell under the Saci banner in that first Akaviri invasion after the pirate raids had been done and the humans had been integrated into the Saci civilization, first as slaves and maybe later as normal second-class citizens or even regular citizens. So, pretty interesting story, and to me at least even more interesting implications. But I think now is the time to move on to the next subject, specifically one that some of you may already know, but is still very much worth telling: the story of Fjori and Holgier. Two doomed Nord lovers who lived in Skyrim's Merethic era far before our playtime and whose ghosts we can still meet in the game. So this story takes place in an ancient time, likely somewhere during the early First Era or late Merethic era, likely during the final years of the Dragon Cult or early Nordic Kingdom. That period. Although we aren't fully sure on the timescale, but that's just to give you a bit of a timescale idea and to make you realize that to the people of modern day Tamriel of whom we learn this story to them was at least more than 2000 years ago, meaning that it's most likely legend at this point and details may be exaggerated or wrong, but we do know that the story, or at least a version of it, happened because we can find ghosts of the unlucky lovers in the game, so this legend, or at least a version of it, did actually take place somewhere during Tamriel's history. Anyway, during this ancient time the peoples of Skyrim were colonizing Skyrim ever further south. They had started along the northern coast where they landed and they were now pushing southward. Now those who trekked southward likely organized themselves in clans, as there wasn't any central government in Skyrim yet or it wasn't very strong. And these colonist clans mostly ruled themselves and the patches of land they claimed. One of these clans was led by the mighty warlord Holgier, a warrior of great renown, who led his clan in settling down in the northern parts of what is now the Rift. However, there was a slight problem, because in the area there was another clan, a clan who also claimed the area. These two clans warred with each other over supremacy and regularly skirmished in Skyrim's ancient forests. Until one day, right in the middle of a large battle between the two clans, the warlord Holgier crossed the 29-year-old huntress Fjori on the battlefield, who was a champion of her people. They crossed eyes and then crossed blades and found each other worthy opponents as they ended up fighting for hours. Their fight, according to legend, was so impressive that it made all the warriors of both clans stop fighting as they watched on silently as the two great warriors fought. After hours of fighting, Holgier's axe allegedly broke on Fjori's sword, but her sword had become so blunt because of his shield that it was barely more than a piece of scrap metal at this point. With no weapons left to fight with, they acknowledged each other as equals, and a bond of mutual respect formed between them, which, according to legend, quickly blossomed into a love for the ages. And with their love came peace and understanding between the two clans, who now lived in Skyrim's ancient forest as one, as the clan chief and their champion's love united them. However, as they say, happiness never lasts forever, and after some time Holgier became terminally ill, according to legend because of a snake bite's poison. Whether that was truly the cause we don't know, but we do know that Fjori searched high and low for a cure for her lover's affliction. Legend says that she then obtained a mysterious elixir from the Akaviri. How, we don't exactly know, but she either sailed to Akavir all by herself, or she obtained them from Akaviri raiders which hounded Tamriel's coast in these ancient times, which we also hear in another ancient Tamrielic story, the story of Lyrisius the Dragon Rider. A link to that story is in the description, by the way, if you're in the mood for more ancient Tamriel stories. Either way, no matter how she obtained it in truth, she obtained a cure for Holgier's affliction in the end, so she rushed home only to find her lover on his deathbed. She then gave him the elixir and according to legend Holgier was instantly cured. However, their reunion in good health was to be short-lived, as according to the legend the snake which had bitten Holgier returned as she gave him the last bit of medicine, and then, of course, the snake bit her instead. With the immense fatigue from her journey having exhausted herself and depleted her completely of energy, the snake's bite was almost immediately fatal and she passed away before a medicine could be found for her. Now, I highly doubt the whole snake thing here. It more likely was either assassins, with the snake being an allegory for traitor, or perhaps it was like a contagious sickness which Fjori contracted while caring for Holgier and giving him the medicine. I mean, what are the chances that that exact same snake fellow comes back and goes like, Lamau XD, I'ma bite the other one now, right when she used all the medicine? So yeah, that's likely legend. So yeah, but their story doesn't end here, as Holgier was so grief-stricken that he decided to dedicate the remaining of his life to building a tomb for Fjori and himself so that they could rest forever together in death. And just like with the Romeo and Juliet story, in the end Holgier didn't want to live on without Fjori, so upon completing their tomb, he took his own life to rejoin her in death. Their two clans then buried them together in their tomb, after which the clans would use that tomb, Ansilvud, which had become a symbol for their clan's unity, as a burial ground for both clans, expanding the tomb for others to be interred in it, but leaving the central inner tomb with the two lovers forever closed. and that was to be their final resting place. However, as with so many dead in a world where necromancers exist, their eternal slumber together was eventually disrupted. Because in the 4th era, a necromancer by the name of Lula Alskaven invaded their tomb, resurrecting the ancient clansmen of Fjori and Holgier, who had also been interned in the large tomb, forcing them to excavate the deeper parts of the tomb and unlock the ancient resting place of the lovers. The necromancer had been drawn to this ancient tomb because of the story of the ancient lovers, and crucially, this necromancer was kind of a rocker. You see, Lula Alskaven lost her husband in the Great War, and because of it she held a grudge against the Empire, since the Empire hadn't even returned his remains to her, rather burning his body before she could say her goodbyes. Now, this seems to be a pretty standard procedure for pre-modern armies, but logic does not soothe a grieving heart, and nor does it prevent people from turning mad. Because through some mad way of thinking, Lula Alskaven assumed that somehow if she obtained the body of Holgier, one of Tamriel's most ancient legendary lovers, she would be able to raise his body and rip her husband's soul from Aetherius and place it in Holgier's ancient body, using it as a vessel so that she could be with her husband again. Why Holgier's body was needed? No idea. Perhaps it had something to do with him dying in heartache, which may have made the process easier, but I have no idea. It might just have been the mad thoughts of a very grief-stricken woman who was acting out of desperation. Her experiment, however, never ended up succeeding, but with her necromantic rituals in the attempt, she did manage to tear Holgier and Fjori's souls from their bodies and enslave their spirits and bodies, making them bow to her will. The player can then venture into Anselwood and kill Lula Alskaven, once more freeing Fjori and Holgier's souls. Their souls will then appear to the player and thank the player for freeing them so that they can be together again in afterlife. And they bestow then upon the player a unique ghost sword, aptly named Ghostblade. And that was the story of Fjori and Holgier. Now, for the next story I'm supposed to make a little joke. Have you ever heard the tragedy of Vahlok the Wise? I thought not, it's not a story Mirak would tell you. Okay, sorry. We're talking about Vahlok the Wise, a dragon priest who lived in the Merethic era and fought with Mirak long before our playtimes. His story is quite interesting, as you'll see. Dragon priests came from an age of hatred and tyranny, being given permission and immense power to reign over the men of First Era Skyrim by their dragon overlords. We know these priests in the way that we battle them in their respective tombs in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. They are in their current lich-like appearance, and that's a perfect representation of most of their evil nature. While studying the dragon priests of Skyrim, we see a recurring theme of cruelty directed towards the human settlements by the dragon priests, but there were several dragon priests that supposedly governed their territory properly. One of whom was Vahlok, or Guardian in the Dova tongue. He was a priest that was given a specific part of Solstheim to rule in favor of the dragon cult. His early life is largely unknown due to the fact that there aren't any readable scrolls and scripts left from the First Era, but considering his title as dragon priest, Vahlok probably underwent the same indoctrination process as the other dragon priests. The dragon cult must have then seen extraordinary traits of power within him, and thus eventually he would be promoted to dragon priest. His role in Solstheim was insignificant at first, seeing as there were other dragon priests such as Mirak, Azidal, Dukan and Zakrisos occupying other lands in the region. Most of the dragon priests in Vahlok's time had basically their own ulterior motives and interests at heart, meaning that they were mostly forwarding their own interests, while either neglecting their human subjects or straight up abusing them to get to their interests. This trend of abuse was common mainly because the fact that dragon priests got corrupted by the sense of power that the dragon cult gave them over the years, and they ended up using it to further develop their own talents and strengths. It's important to understand that it did not start like that, as at the beginning dragon priests were mostly fair rulers, especially back on Atmora before the Inuits came to Tamriel. The dragon priests there functioned as the heads of the dragon cult, the ancient Nedic religion which worshipped the animals and then saw the dragons as chief among the animals. The dragon cult saw the dragons as their rightful rulers, as they were intelligent beings and that they were far more powerful than the humans. And as we have touched on before in other videos, dragons saw themselves as entitled to rule over the mortal humans as they were far more powerful. However, the dragons weren't, particularly concerned with stuff like government. They just wanted the humans to worship them and then absolutely dominate over them. Thus, there were several mortal men appointed as the rulers over mankind who ruled in the name of the dragons and functioned as a sort of link between the dragons and their subjects, and who made sure that the wishes of the dragons got to relate to the subjects. In the first couple of centuries this went really well, and the dragon priests, which were the link between the dragons and the humans, they were fair rulers and, the whole thing worked. but as time went on, some went corrupted, and this was especially so with Tamriel's dragon priests, who started oppressing the people for their own gains. The dragons, as overlords of the dragon cult, although they were aware of this, often didn't really mind, since it meant that their priests were getting stronger and their rule would even be harder to dispute for the mortals that they were oppressing. One thing that they failed to control, however, was the civil unrest that unraveled as a result of their neglect, and thus eventually led to the Dragon War. However, there were exceptions to that rule of civil unrest, specifically the dragon priest of Atmora, and on Solstheim there was Vahlok, who focused his wisdom and power on governing his people fairly, while simultaneously showing his undying loyalty to the dragon cult. Ancient Skal folklore basically paints him as a noble and wise man in terms of governing. He treated his subjects fairly, which in turn motivated them to function more efficiently. This was apparent to the dragon cult because of how prosperous his settlements were, and his reputation steadily rose as one of the most loyal and beloved priests of the dragon cult. Folklore also seems to link Vahlok to a time of peace and prosperity for the people of Solstheim, something we don't really expect to hear when discussing the legacy and history of most dragon priests. As for the other dragon priests over Solstheim, Miraak was presumably the highest ranking dragon priest at the time. Him conspiring against the dragon cult by allying with the Daedric prince Hermaeus Mora took the dragon cult by surprise, as they suddenly had a turncoat in their hands. Vahlok was the first to discover Miraak's secret planning and proceeded to successfully rally both men and dragons loyal to the dragon cult to confront Miraak. Their confrontation was brutal, and legend says that they battled for what seemed like days on end, splintering Solstheim with their sheer magical power. At this point, we're faced with multiple possibilities on the outcome of this battle, because some accounts claim that Vahlok eventually defeated Miraak, but that Hermaeus Mora then transported a fatally wounded Miraak to Apocrypha before Vahlok could deal the killing blow. Vahlok was then made to swear an oath that he would watch for Miraak's potential return, since of course Miraak hadn't been killed. Other reports, however, claim that Vahlok managed to weaken Miraak enough to transport him to his monastery, where he was jailed in a tomb created by the ancient Skal. Vahlok then kept vigilant watch over the tomb, and even after Miraak's death, he was left in the tomb. Either way, both stories make it clear that after this magnificent battle, Vahlok was given numerous accolades of bravery and glory, making him the ruler of all of Solstheim for a long time, and he was the jailer of Miraak, hence the name Vahlok the Jailer. If we encounter Vahlok in Lich form during the Elder Scrolls V Dragonborn DLC, we notice that he actually bears no mask, as you could see in all the screenshots in this video. This little detail could give us further information about what happened during the battle, because his mask might have been destroyed in the battle, or maybe he did not wear one, or maybe he was never simply issued one, because the latter seems less likely due to his reputation with the dragon cult after Miraak was defeated, since, he was one of the highest ranking dragon priests and thus probably got a mask. However, some say that the masks of the dragon priests were actually given to the priests as powerful artifacts to serve as a tool for keeping their people under control. So, if that theory is true, Vahlok might not really have needed one, since he was pretty beloved by his own people, and thus might not even need a mask or might not even want one. We don't know the exact details on that one. As far as the dragon priests go, however, Vahlok definitely stood out from the rest, as all we hear from the dragon priests are basically the atrocities that the other priests committed. But as I mentioned before, there was a different time, as during the time of the dragon cult back in Atmora, priests like Vahlok were the common standard, which is why we never really heard of any major dragon rebellions in Atmora. People were often kept in check and given a reasonable amount of humanity and ruled over fairly, like under Vahlok on Solstheim. This mentality of fair rule became a blurred line after Atmora, and years after their expansion into Skyrim, things started to change for the worse for the dragon cult, as dragon priests started to abuse their people. If the entirety of the dragon cult's dragon priests ruled like Vahlok, there would have probably been less turmoil within the societies of men back in the day. Regardless, men are easily corrupted, and there's a lust for power that's beyond them, which is why such a cult would have likely eventually crumbled anyway. But if all of the dragon priests hadn't been corrupted, we might have seen the dragon cult, survive into maybe the second era or maybe even the third era. So, that was the story of Vahlok the Wise, or Vahlok the Jailer. A pretty interesting story. Now, next up, let's talk about one of the more infamous people from ancient Tamriel. Its first Pirate King Red Bramman. So, Red Bramman. As we can see on his official art, he was an Argonian pirate, and he was one of the most legendary pirates of his era. His actions back then were unprecedented for a pirate. You see, this story plays in the First Era, back when the First Cyrodiilic Empire, or the Alessian Empire, ruled Cyrodiil. They didn't yet have control over any of the southern provinces, which meant that nearly all of the trade that the Empire conducted with the southern regions of Tamriel, which were independent from the Empire, all passed through this region, the Topal Bay, in order to reach the Empire's heart, which is the Imperial city. And you know what that means? Lots of ships loaded with valuables, materials, gold and other treasures. They all pass through this tropical region in the south, and where there's treasure, there's people bound to look at that treasure and think, "Arr, matey, that be mine now." Yeah, okay, I can't do this. Anyway, back in the First Era, the Topal Bay became a region filled with pirates looking to steal the Empire's valuables. And none of those pirates was as notorious as Red Bramman, an Argonian pirate sailing the high seas with his trusty crew. It's said that his crew was fiercely loyal to him, and it seems that they had some sort of initiation trials as well to be fully accepted into the crew, which resulted in each crew member tattooing a gust of wind on their face, once that they had been fully accepted into the crew or reached a certain level of respect by the others in the crew. His crew eventually grew massive, with several other ships in his fleet under Red Bramman's command. They raided and pillaged the trade routes of the Topal Bay, and despite significant Imperial efforts to apprehend him and sink his ships, he managed to continually evade the Imperial Navy and then just disappear when they almost got him. He became richer and richer, and he plundered ship after ship. Now, like I said, every time the Empire sent ships to apprehend him, he managed to somehow get away with his ships, just mysteriously disappearing. To the Empire, this was a very big mystery and an even bigger headache, as trade seriously suffered under the raids of Red Bramman and his crew. And it didn't take long for Empress Hestra, the then ruler of the Alessian Empire, to personally get involved and order Red Bramman's head to be delivered to her personally, allegedly setting almost half the entire Imperial Navy upon Red Bramman's fleet. But they wouldn't catch him or his fleet anytime soon. You see, the Empire back then had very little knowledge of Black Marsh, knowing nearly nothing of its geography, as almost no humans had ever entered the treacherous swamps. But Red Bramman, being a Black Marsh native, did know the secrets of the swamp, and he knew that there was a river which flowed through the Black Marsh towards the Topal Bay, which was deep enough to allow ships to sail into the marshes and the bayous. This meant that every time the Imperials were on his tail, he just made some maneuvers and then made his fleet sail into the swamps as they sailed along the river and just disappeared in the thicket. And when the Imperials then reached the place that he entered the swamps, they assumed simply that he disappeared, because they had no idea where the pirates had gone, as they assumed that the swamps and bogs were inaccessible to ships. Now, as Red Bramman's crew grew, so did his power. He eventually founded the Pirate and Bandit Kingdom in Black Marsh, becoming the first pirate king of Tamriel, with his kingdom laying deep within the swamps along the river from which they could easily enter the Topal Bay to raid more valuables from the Imperials. It was a kingdom of great variety, as pirates of all races joined this mighty crew, with even many humans and elves apparently joining his crew. Interestingly, these humans and elves that joined Red Bramman's crew were some of the first humans and elves to ever enter the deep swamps of Black Marsh, and the first to ever contact the Argonian tribes of the swamps. And it wasn't pleasant first contact, as Red Bramman, being a pirate, allowed the extortion and exploitation and enslavement of the native tribes by the humans and the elves in his kingdom. And it's said that this unpleasant first contact with the Argonians of the marshes was one of the primary reasons why Argonians would remain very wary and distrusting of man and mer for a very long time after the defeat of Red Bramman. Anyway, after some time, the Imperial Navy managed to discover how Red Bramman and his crew managed to evade capture for such a long time through the rivers and marshes of Black Marsh, and the Empress then sent an entire Imperial fleet into the marshes to catch Red Bramman and burn his pirate kingdom completely to the ground. This apparently resulted in a long and violent battle, as the Imperial Navy discovered more and more outposts the further along the river they came, until they came to the heart of his kingdom, where eventually they managed to penetrate into the kingdom's very center, where Red Bramman was caught and apprehended by the crew of a ship called the Dominus Fatum, which was part of the fleet sent into the marshes. That ship had apparently run aground during the expedition, but its crew had disembarked and they had roamed the swamps on foot, where they then eventually encountered Red Bramman in the center of his kingdom. They then captured him and beheaded him, delivering his head to Empress Hestra, ending the story of the first pirate king, someone who's driven the empire to desperate measures with his clever plunder and hide strategy. However, as with all stories from the First Era, considering it's so long before any of our playtimes, we don't really know how much of these details are actually true and how much of the narratives has been changed by the writers for whatever reason. I bring this up because while we know that Bramman existed, what race he was exactly is strangely unclear. In almost all the sources written by Imperials, he is described as a man with red hair, which earned him his name, Red Bramman. While in official art and some other sources, he is an Argonian with red scales, with the red scales likely earning his name. Which of these is true, we don't know. However, an explanation could be that since Red Bramman managed to outwit the Alessian Empire a few times in a time where the Empire had very little knowledge of Argonians, and most people in the Empire saw them as common beasts below man, it's possible that official Imperial records changed him to be a man so that the damage he inflicted on the Empire would be less humiliating to the population, who back then again thought very little of Argonians. It's either that or perhaps a retcon, but explaining those is my day job at this point, so yeah, this race is just quite ambiguous. That being said, that's basically the entire story of the infamous pirate King Red Bramman. His story would remain a legend and an inspiration for other pirates over the ages, with especially the Sea Elf or Marmor pirates of Piandene, apparently taking on a few of his tactics and customs. And perhaps, if the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place in Hammerfell and we get a pirate questline of sorts, we might learn more about his legend, but for now that's basically all we know. Meaning that that's about all I can say about Red Bramman. Now, next up, let's talk about someone who was so insane that I think even Sheogorath might sincerely respect him. The ancient Sea Elf Necromancer Uldor. So, Uldor the Necromancer. He was a Sea Elf or Marmor, Governor and Necromancer who lived somewhere during either the late Merethic era or the early First era, at a time when Elsewhere was not in any way united and was fractured into the 16 Khajiit kingdoms that we talked about before on this channel. Link in the description if you want to know more about this period of Khajiit history. But what's important to know is that at this time the Khajiit were not unified, and that Khajiit kingdoms of the continent mostly just concerned themselves with the mainland. And that brings us to this little island, Khenarthi's Roost. It's one of the many islands south of Tamriel, and just like many of the other islands to the south, this island had been occupied by the Marmor or Sea Elves for long periods of its history. As the Sea Elves, who come from the southern continent of Piandene, have used their outposts on these small islands to facilitate their pirate or privateer fleets that they used to raid the trade routes of southern Tamriel, particularly those belonging to their ancient enemies, the High Elves or the Altmer of Somerset. Now, as I said, Khenarthi's Roost during its history has often been occupied by the Sea Elves, and while the island is mostly inhabited by Khajiit, who use the island's rich soil for moon sugar plantations, over the course of its history they have often been ruled over by the Sea Elves, and somewhere during the late Merethic or early First era, the Sea Elf governor to the island was one of their mages, an elf named Uldor. Now, Uldor wasn't a particularly pleasant ruler for the island. It's said that he ruled with an iron fist and that he heavily exploited the local Khajiit and their plantations. And while that is bad enough on its own, he also dabbled heavily in necromancy, and was quite an inventive necromancer at that, because he discovered how to split his spirit and body from each other without killing off his body, being able to return whenever he wanted. But more importantly, this spirit-body split allowed him to possess both corpses and the living. It's likely that specifically his ability to possess the living beings was feared during this time, as we can see during the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, that with his separate spirit he was even able to possess very accomplished mages and make them do exactly as he wanted. Now, whether or not it was because of this power or just because he was already a little insane to begin with, he started to go completely off his rocker at some point, as it seems that he had those who did not obey him simply killed, only to then quote-unquote wear their corpses like clothes. He started to, in his own words, really enjoy wearing other people's bodies, and as such he amassed quite a collection at the Khajiit temple from which he ruled. That's disgusting. In fact, when Nordic raiders from Windhelm, who had sailed all along Tamriel's coast to plunder everywhere, arrived on the island, Uldor simply killed all of them, only to then add their bodies to his quote-unquote wardrobe. This guy was completely off his rocker, calling his victims his outfits and making categories on how fresh the flesh was and categorizing them on when he wanted to wear the corpses, specifically keeping them for seasons, so wearing some of them in autumn and some of them in summer, winter and spring. Now, this complete insanity fortunately did not go unnoticed by his Marmor subordinates, and the Marmor who occupied the island banded together with the local Khajiit to depose the mad necromancer. The Khajiit and Marmor rose up and fought their way to Uldor's temple, fighting the corpses he now raised to fight them. But they managed to reach the mad sorcerer and eventually kill his body. Unfortunately for them, just before his own living body was killed, Uldor apparently separated his body and spirit again, and thus managed to live on as a spirit, occupying other bodies. The fight against him must have seemed hopeless, but fortunately some of his own people had an ace up their sleeve. They had brought a special kind of binding stone from Pjandene and used sea elf incantations on the stone, which bound Uldor's spirit to the stone, transferring the energy his spirit had generated into water. How exactly this works? No idea, it's sea elf magic. We barely know anything about Tamrielic magic, much less so from the other continents. But this magic, while it didn't destroy his spirit, it did make his spirit harmless by seemingly siphoning off the energy generated by his spirit and then converting it into water, making his spirit powerless and turning Uldor's old temple into a practical freshwater spring. This temple would become known as the Temple of Morning Springs, and the stone which bound his spirit as the Morning Stone. That's mourning as in mourning the dead and not mourning as in morning, as in when the sun rises. Now this name likely came to commemorate those who were lost to Uldor's madness, and for centuries Uldor's spirit was sealed away in the temple, his energy providing clean fresh water for the plantations on the island. And eventually Uldor and his evils were all but forgotten, his name lost to history, and the stone which sealed his spirit became a Khajiit religious object, because it provided fresh water for their plantations. But as happens to almost all sealed evils eventually, Uldor managed to escape his sealing, and not because the marmor magic which held him in place no longer worked, no. Some high elf scholars, wondering how the stone produced fresh energy and how it worked, they took the stone from the temple, and guess what? This freed Uldor's soul, and he immediately started raising an army of the dead in order to take his island back. You, as the player, can then help reseal him in the Elder Scrolls Online, and thus reactivate the Endless Spring, and once more make the island safe and a prosperous place for plantations, because it has so much fresh water. Now, this quest is pretty generic in the Elder Scrolls Online and didn't really pay too much mind to it, personally, until I discovered this backstory, and then I felt like Uldor's insanity story definitely deserved its own video. I mean, this guy was just completely insane. I mean, he wore corpses as clothes and even has this very own summer collection and autumn collection of corpses. Doesn't get more insane than that, and I think even Sheogorath would have been like, wow. Now, that's about all I can say about the Necromancer Uldor, but talking about Sheogorath, there's one very interesting story from the First Era you should know. It's about the time when Sheogorath tricked Shalidor, one of the greatest mages of the First Era, and basically of all time. So as we've talked about before on this channel, Shalidor was a revolutionary mage. He was the first to take on the title of Archmage. He supposedly built the city of Winterhold, allegedly fought by himself against an entire army of Dwemer, took on the ancient Nordic city of Labyrinthian as his own personal laboratory, contributed to the foundations of the Magicka schools, founded the College of Winterhold, and was one of the first humans to have ever extended their life far past their regular lifespan. And when he finally died, he made sure that his tomb had certain enchantments that his spirit could be called back to Tamriel when the mages of the world would need him. He was, let's just say, a quite accomplished guy, and he lived somewhere in the early First Era around the year 400. For a more extensive overview of his life, I recommend checking out my older lore video on Shalidor's life. It's a bit older, the narration isn't as smooth as it is now, but the lore is still good, so feel free to check that one out. That being said, near the end of his mortal life, when he'd left Labyrinthian, Shalidor started working on a project near and dear to his heart. He wanted to create a safe haven for mages of all eras to come, so that even when he himself died, he would have created a place where magic would be explored to the utmost, without limitations and the interference of those who mean peaceful researchers and mages either harm or want to use them for their own gains. As such, he created Aivea, a small island to be run by himself and, after his death, by other mages. The island was to be fully independent from all other nations and just be run by mages for the purpose of peaceful exploration of magic. For the location of this little mage paradise, he chose a beautiful small island to the west of Tamriel, which officially fell in the rule of the King of Eleanor. In exchange for some magical secrets and artifacts, the King of Eleanor was willing to give the island away to Shalidor. Shalidor agreed and then hired a small army of elven builders from the Somerset Isles to build facilities on the island. Everything was quickly built on the previously uninhabited island, from a small practice ground, a mage hall, laboratories to a port. It was the ultimate safe haven for mages, and soon Shalidor made it his new home, along with a small legion of other mages and apprentices. For a few years the island flourished as mages from far and wide came to use its facilities and to become one of Shalidor's apprentices. But it wouldn't be long until a self-made disaster struck, because you see, at this time Shalidor was researching a life-extending secret, which
the research wasn't going too well, but then the Daedric Prince of Madness, Sheogorath, appeared to him. The Prince of Madness had noticed that Shalidor was a little bit stuck in his research, and he just so happened to have something that could very much help Shalidor with his research. The Folum Discognitum, a Daedric artifact, a book created by Sheogorath which is filled with quote-unquote the collections of ramblings of madmen. That is nearly incomprehensible to most people, but apparently can be used by very skilled mages to discern very valuable information and techniques only madmen would be able to come up with. And apparently this book contained just what Shalidor needed to progress with his research. So Sheogorath appeared to him, and he came with a deal. We don't know exactly what this deal was, but it was some sort of wager. Sheogorath bet the Folum Discognitum on the outcome, and Shalidor bet the island of Ivea on the outcome, counting on the fact that he would be able to outsmart the Mad God. But he couldn't, and he lost the island to Sheogorath in this bet. According to Shalidor's dialogue, he had to witness the island being swallowed into Sheogorath's realm of oblivion, his apprentices and his colleagues screaming all the while as they were being brought into the Shivering Isles, which is Sheogorath's realm. This became Shalidor's greatest regret in life, and he would spend much of what remained of his mortal life trying to somehow get Ivea back, becoming obsessed with trying to find a way to steal the island back from Sheogorath and bring the island back to Nirn. But the Mad God is not easily tricked, and all of Shalidor's attempts failed. He worked day and night trying to get the island back, so much actually that his wife ended up leaving him because of his obsession, and supposedly Shalidor then died alone not many years later, never being able to fix his greatest failure. That is, until the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, because remember what I said about him enchanting his tomb in such a way that his spirit would be pulled back when the mages of the world truly needed him? Well, during the Three Banners War, as the Mages Guild was trapped in forced neutrality in a large-scale war and Daedra overran the continent, killing a lot of mages, Shalidor's tomb activated and his spirit was pulled back to Tamriel to help his fellow mages. This is the story of the Elder Scrolls Online's Mages Guild questline. When you're on a somewhat routine mission for the Mages Guild, Shalidor's spirit appears to you and he tells you that he needs you to accomplish a great task, creating or rather bringing back a sanctuary for mages all across Tamriel so that they could study in peace rather than being dragged into a senseless war. You as the player and your Mages Guild mentor, a very accomplished high elf mage named Vahlok, see creating such a sanctuary as a great idea, so you decide to help Shalidor's spirit out. You as the player and Shalidor then enter the Shivering Isles, with Shalidor claiming that he's found a way to bring the island back using some magical books. But as you enter the Shivering Isles, Sheogorath appears to you, and of course he refuses to give you those books. Instead, he offers you a challenge. There are 4 magical books that Shalidor needs to bring the island back, so Sheogorath offers you 4 trials. You, the player, for each challenge that you complete, you get one of the books. You decide to agree. But as always with the Mad God, there is a catch. He never told you the locations of these trials. Rather, he hides hints to the locations in some of his own mad writings and gives you one for every trial. And Shalidor isn't allowed to help you with deciphering the hints. If he helps, the Mad God will no longer uphold the bargain. Luckily, you are of course part of the Mages Guild, and as such many people are skilled decipherers, and your mentor, Vahlok, can help you and Shalidor with deciphering the hints. So 4 trials, 4 hints. The trials are pretty weird, as is the case for most dealings that we have with Sheogorath. For example, in one, you have to play the main character in one of Sheogorath's mad plays, where the main character is a psychopath. In the other, you have to get his Fork of Horripilation back, and in one you have to evict people from Sheogorath's mad hotel. You know, Sheogorath stuff. Honestly, it's a pretty fun questline. You should play it, not gonna lie. However, as you are completing Sheogorath's trials, you start to notice that the deciphering of Sheogorath's writings is very taxing on your mentor Vahlok's mind, as you notice that slowly but surely the Mad God's writings are starting to affect her and she's slowly going mad. However, she's stubborn and she refuses to let anyone translate the writings. This means that when the 4 trials are completed, Vahlok is basically teetering on the edge of madness. But 4 trials were completed, so as promised Sheogorath brings the island back to Tamriel. But once again there's a catch, because he of course never said in what state he would bring the island back to Tamriel. So, Sheogorath being Sheogorath, the island is completely covered in Shivering Isles mushroom and other plants, but that's not even the worst, because Sheogorath has also sent a contingent of Daedra populating his realm along with the island. An entire legion of Dark Seductions and Golden Saints is stationed on the island, and it's up to you, the player, to get rid of them. So, You clean up the island by fighting some Daedra, and then Sheogorath once more appears, while your mentor Valast's mind is now truly starting to wander away from her. She's really becoming mad. Now, Sheogorath then reveals that this was all his grand design, as he cursed the writings containing the hints to the trials, and now Valast desperately wants to go with him to the Shivering Isles. Shalidor refuses to get Valast go with Sheogorath to the Isles, but as usual during this questline, and trust me, this happens a lot, Sheogorath just pretends Shalidor is unimportant and shoves him aside, and instead asking you, the player, what to do. And he asks whether he can take Valast with him to the Shivering Isles or not. If you give him Valast, he promises to give you the very thing that Shalidor was once looking for, the Folium Discognitum. Now, that choice is up to you. Will you send Valast and her spirit forever to the Shivering Isles in madness, or will you claim the Folium Discognitum, which gives you quite some power, 2 whole free skill points in the Elder Scrolls Online? I personally chose Valast, as refusing to take her also results in Sheogorath removing the madness from her, but then you do sacrifice 2 skill points, so, you know, it's up to you. That said, the island is then free from Sheogorath and his Daedra. The mushrooms remain, but the entire island can now truly become a refuge for mages, with a tad of madness in the flora. And good all good, as they say. Unless you send Valast to the Shivering Isles, then you doomed someone to madness for the rest of eternity, but hey, at least you get some free skill points. Now, what happened to Ivea after the Second Era, we don't really know. The island came under Independent Mages Guild rule when Shalidor's spirit once again left Nirn after the questline, and presumably it remained that way for a while, maybe even up until the Third Era. Since it's geographically speaking close to the Altmeri Dominion in the 4th Era and the Mages Guild has fallen apart by that time, I wouldn't be surprised if the Thalmor have claimed the island in the 4th Era, likely scouring it for magical secrets left behind by the mages of previous eras. But to be fair, that's all just speculation. If the Elder Scrolls 6 is set as Hammerfell and we get free exploration of the Abyssinian Sea, you know, Assassin's Creed Black Flag style with boats, as I speculated that we might get, we might be able to visit Ivea again at some point and learn of its fate, but for now this is the island's full story. And really, I can recommend playing this questline. It's a bit wonky since it's all solo dungeons in the Elder Scrolls Online, but yeah, it's really good. Like, Sheogorath's role is played perfectly, like how he would usually do it, and just the interactions of Sheogorath and Shalidor are just amazing, because Shalidor is really angry about what Sheogorath did to his island, even though, I mean, he went on the bargain himself. But, you know, Sheogorath just keeps ignoring him, calling him names, that kind of thing. It's just perfect. It's a really good story, to be honest, so I can recommend playing that questline if you're looking for something to play in the Elder Scrolls universe.
And that was the story of when Sheogorath tricked Shalidor. Now, next up is a very interesting story. The story of Cyrodiil's Minotaur Emperor. The second emperor of the Alessian Empire, and as far as we know, the only Minotaur to ever be emperor. Alright, so Emperor Belharza, the Minotaur Emperor, and according to legend, the first Minotaur. His story is quite interesting and starts well before his birth, back in the early years of the First Era. At this time, the humans of Cyrodiil lived as slaves under the oppressive rule of the Aelid Empire. The Aelid elves enslaved the humans to be used as tools, but the Aelid Empire weakened eventually, and the humans of Cyrodiil rose up against their Aelid masters in what was called the Alessian Slave Rebellion. This rebellion, which saw the humans free themselves and overthrow several Aelid kingdoms, was led by a figure which now has mythical status, Slave Queen Alessia. Alessia, however, did not lead the rebellion on her own, for at her side were 2 great champions with now equal mythical status. The first to come to her was the demigod Morihos, who was deemed to be a son of Cain and who appeared to the people as a large bull with wings, walking on its hind legs. The second champion of Alessia was the crusader Pelennor Whitestrake, who single-handedly took down armies of Aelids, according to the legends. Together they founded the Alessian Empire, of whom Alessia became the first leader, the first empress. And you may notice how I often use the words mythical status and according to legend, as all this stuff took place almost 3000 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, and more than 4000 years before the events of Skyrim. If we count the Middle Dawn Dragonbreak, of course, and even if we don't, it's still more than 3000 years before Skyrim. Anyway, that is important to remember, as all we have on the Alessian Slave Rebellion are mythical stories. Sources on a lot of details are very fuzzy. So, although we can be fairly sure the story as I recounted it to you is the way that it most likely happened, there's still some fuzziness on details. Either way, what is important for the story that I'm telling you today is that Slave Queen Alessia was, according to the sources that we have, romantically involved with the demigod Morihos, who again came in the shape of a large bipedal bull with wings, according to the most recent and vast majority of the sources. Their love spawned a child, which they named Belharza, who was half human like his mother Alessia and half bull like his father Morihos. He was, according to legend, the first Minotaur to walk on Tamriel. Although there are some conflicting sources stating that Minotaurs were already on Tamriel by that time, but again this stuff all plays 3000 years before the Elder Scrolls Online and now has mythical status on Tamriel, so let's take it all with a grain of salt. What we are almost certain of is that Belharza was a Minotaur and that he was the son of Alessia and Morihos. And there are sources saying that his horns were specifically distinct from his father Morihos, who was a regular bull instead of a Minotaur. We even have this sketch of former Elder Scrolls developer Michael Kirkbride of what a young Belharza could have looked like, including a sketch of an older Belharza by the same guy. And as you can see in the sketch of the older Belharza, he's wearing the Amulet of Kings, which I took the liberty of giving a red shade. Anyway, he was indeed able to wear the Amulet of Kings as he carried Alessia's blood and was supposedly the first true bearer of the amulet when his mother passed away, as he, as her legitimate son, became the second emperor of the Alessian Empire. He wore the amulet after his mother's soul had been imbued within it by Akatosh and the divine pact to keep Mundus safe from the threat of oblivion had been established. It is likely that he was the very first Tamrielic emperor to light the dragon fires at the Imperial city, which was by then only recently conquered by the humans from the Aelids. But his reign as emperor was not a peaceful one, as wars with the remaining Aelid kingdoms continued to rage on, and it's said that Emperor Belharza fought on the front lines himself against the elves, together with other Minotaurs, who at this point were civilized citizens of the Empire and would continue to be so for several decades. Not much is known about his reign, but like I said, the closest reference point Elder Scrolls Online has his reign being almost 3000 years ago, but here's what we do know of his life. We know that he had quite a good relationship with his mother, Empress Alessia, as they often exchanged private letters as Belharza fought on the fronts while she was still alive, most likely ruling things from the Imperial city. We know that he ascended to the throne in the year 266 of the First Era and that he died somewhere before the year 358, as then his son was in power. Because we know that during his lifetime he took a wife and he had a son named Amiel, who would succeed him as emperor. We do not know which race Amiel was, as with a union of mortals, customarily the race of the mother is the race of the child, with Belharza likely being an exception, due to his father Morihos being a demigod and thus not a regular mortal, and thus Belharza became half man and half bull. Now here's the thing, one reason that we know so precious little about Emperor Belharza is because in the year 361 of the First Era, only 95 years after Belharza's ascension to the throne and his coronation, the Alessian Order, a sect of human extremists, became the dominant political power in the Alessian Empire. They persecuted elves, trying to wipe them from the empire, but also ousted other non-human races, among which were eventually the Minotaurs. At some point during their prominence, the Alessian Order banished Minotaurs from society, shunning them from society and branding them outcasts. This began the decline of Minotaurs from proud members of the Empire to the creatures that we see today. But it's not just the contemporary Minotaurs which they outcasted. The Alessian Order reportedly also removed all of Minotaur history from the Imperial history, among which was the history of Emperor Belharza, who was scratched from the history books by them, and even Morihos, whom they tried to describe as human in newer history books instead of the winged bull demigod. Due to this effort by the Alessian Order to remove Emperor Belharza from history, all that remains from his rule are fragments, weathered etchings and scraps, but due to these scraps which the Alessian Order failed to destroy, we do know that he was there and that he was a Minotaur, and that he existed as emperor. And if he truly is an ancestor to all Minotaurs, that would mean that all the Minotaurs have Alessian blood in them, but then again, this is all 3000 years ago from our nearest reference frame, Elder Scrolls Online, so it would be like me discovering I have the blood of an Egyptian pharaoh. I mean, yeah, maybe, but it's such a small percentage that it's insignificant. Also, if in a union of mortals the child always becomes the race of the mother, then Belharza, who is a male, would have a very low chance of ever making another Minotaur with a mortal woman, Again, we don't even know the race of his own son and whether he was Minotaur. So yeah, I kind of dispute the story of him being the first Minotaur and all, as we do have some stories of Minotaurs existing before that point, so... let me know what you think. Was he the first Minotaur? Was he not? We don't know. What we do know is that he existed, and that he was a Minotaur, and that he was an emperor over the early Alessian Empire. But that was the story of Emperor Belharza. Now, for the final story in this collection, we're going to look at the Dwemer who tried to create a robot wife. And no, it's unfortunately not as funny as that sounds, because it's a really tragic story. Our story begins in the First Era in northeastern Hammerfell, likely around the year 500 of the First Era. Around this time, the Dwemer Rurken clan had settled across Hammerfell after splitting off from their brethren in Morrowind. For the full story of that whole split and their exodus to Hammerfell and them founding a civilization there, check my video from last weekend on the Rurken Dwemer in the link in the description. Anyway, during this time, the Rurken Dwemer had settled all across Hammerfell, and they had apparently a pretty decent relationship with the Ayleid cities on the borders of High Rock. Although both seemed to be quite mutually distrustful of one another, as other than trade, they didn't seem to mingle all that much. Now, the Ayleid realm on the High Rock border at this time was ruled by an old king named Uriel, who, at least in Elvish history, has gone down as a beloved king and a shrewd diplomat. You see, while most of Elvish royalty doesn't really tend to get that many children, it seems that this king simply disregarded that memo and fathered 23 children, and made sure to marry each of them off to his more powerful Ayleid and Direni rivals and allies in the region, in order to bring prosperity, peace and riches to his realm. Now, likely around the year 500 of the First Era, King Uriel's youngest daughter, Princess Urenenya, came of age to be wed, and as a little bonus, she was described to be the most beautiful of his daughters. So, considering the king's reputation of wedding off his daughters and her beauty, it didn't take all too long for suitors from all over the region to come and ask for her hand. And King Uriel diligently went to work to try find a suitor. However, his daughter defied him and refused to be wed. You see, the princess was already in love at this time, and she had a secret relationship with the Rurken Dwemer high artisan Klatsgar, who led a small band of Dwemer who'd settled and built a workshop close to the High Rock border. Unfortunately for them, the Ayleids, despite trading with the Dwemer, highly distrusted their southern neighbors, so King Uriel simply forbade the relationship. This really shows the distrust that the Ayleids had for the Dwemer, as Klatsgar was actually a pretty influential Dwemer, and you'd say that he would be quite a good ally to have as one of the Dwemer high artisans, who are really some of the most skilled people to ever walk Tamriel, basically. But still, King Uriel wouldn't allow their relationship. And when his daughter then refused to be married off and likely tried to run away, he even locked her up in his castle to keep her away from her lover Klatsgar, so she could be married off to someone else. Now, while this is already quite tragic, it's about to become even worse, as at the time of her being locked up, she was slightly ill. Initially, nobody seemed to have thought much about it, but as she was locked up, her illness became worse and worse, and none of her father's healers seemed to have been able to do much about it. When it became clear that she would likely not survive her illness, she had a letter smuggled out of the palace to her Dwemer lover Klatsgar, telling him of her fate, and then he came up with an idea. You see, as a Dwemer high artisan, he had a lot of tools and technologies at his disposal, and thus he started working on a very special Dwemer automaton. He ended up designing a dwarven centurion which could house a mortal soul in it, with the aim of giving his Ayleid lover a new mechanical body so that they could stay together when she would be released from her father's captivity. When even her father, King Uriel, could see that his daughter would never be free of her illness and that she would likely soon be dead, and thus she was worthless to marry off, he released her from captivity, giving her the freedom to do what she wanted. So she went to Klatsgar, her lover, to say her final goodbyes before her death, as at this point she was practically at death's door. Now, in the meantime, Klatsgar had managed to complete the soul-housing centurion, and as the princess arrived to his workshop, he proposed to her that they put her soul in the machine. The princess was reluctant and not at all enthusiastic about the plan, rather spending her final moments with him in their mortal bodies rather than a few more years as a machine. But he seems to have convinced her, at least we know that he did not force her, as they did decide to go through with the plan eventually, and as such her soul was captured and was put in the centurion's body. But something had gone wrong, something did not go as Klatsgar expected, as Urenenya's soul for some reason couldn't control the machine, and thus she lost the ability to communicate and show any kind of feeling to the outside. to the point where Klatsgar thought that the machine was not conscious at all, and that he simply had killed her. And thus he wept, and filled with grief he likely attempted, but failed, to make the machine work, and not long after, he died alone and in grief. But despite his assumptions that the machine was not conscious, the machine was conscious. You see, the problem seems to have been that Uranenya's soul could not properly control the machine, and that her mind was in the machine all along. Seeing her lover dying of grief and without being able to communicate with him or showing any kind of affection, she was locked in the machine now. And then, for eternity, because her soul was locked and she couldn't escape. Her fate was a mystery to her family, as her soul never ascended to Aetherius, meaning that they could not summon her spirit, and to the public what happened to her was a mystery. Her father forbade mentions of her love for the Dwemer, and eventually she was all but forgotten. But then, long after her lover's death and even the fall of her father's kingdom, more than 2000 years later, the Dwemer workshop that she was locked into got rediscovered, as the sands of the Alakir, which had swallowed it, had now shifted and re-revealed the entrance. We, as the player in Elder Scrolls Online, can enter the ancient ruin and destroy the Centurion, retrieve the soul gem that she was trapped in, and then return it to the Ayleid ruins at Silaseli, the former kingdom of her father, to free her soul, and more than 2000 years later, allow her soul to finally ascend to Aetherius. And that ends the story of these two star-crossed lovers and of this big lore collection. Now, let me know in the comments which story was your favorite, and also if you really made it all the way to the end, also tell me what your favorite book is in the comments. I need something new to read. Yeah, if you're not a book person, you can just say the dictionary or whatever. Just let me know, I need something new to read. If you enjoyed the stories in this video, consider subscribing to the channel, it would really help me out, and returning for my lore videos that I publish weekly. This is a collection of them, but I publish new videos basically every week, sometimes 2 times a week, sometimes once, depending on how much time I have. You know, check them out, it would really help me out. Also subscribe to the channel, we're almost to 100,000. And you know, you really want to be in there before the 100,000, because everybody before the 100,000 I respect, and those after I also respect, but they're not OGs. Okay, I need to stop talking. See you in the next lore video.